standardized tests? Well, SES, socioeconomic status. We know in education, and the Department of Education knows this, that family income and parental education levels are the strongest factor in standardized test scores for students. Hundreds of research studies confer the relationship between family income and parent education levels. If you look at the 35 schools that are on the most underperforming level 4 schools in the state and the 6 new schools, I looked up the data on those schools. On average, they're over 80% poverty. Many of them have 60% of students who do not speak English as their native language. And yet, those teachers and principals are underperforming. Doesn't make any sense. So, one of the concerns is when we take a consistent rule, such as every child will reach proficient, and we factor in the human factor, such as if your parents have books in the house and you ate dinner last night, you might do better on a test. I just was on an audit team that went down to Kentucky to look at schools. 11% of the kids in this district that is considered underperforming, 11% of those kids are homeless. When you're looking for where to sleep tonight and aren't really sure you're going to eat, the last thing you're really concerned about is how you're going to do on the test. So we need to look at the human factors that come into what we're looking at in terms of testing. So journal ed research, of course, several studies. Students' low socioeconomic status has a negative effect on standardized tests. And so when they call these schools that are underperforming, and they're testing them, they might as well just go and test the parents' income. Because that will lead to a better connection between how the schools will score than anything that the teachers are doing. Having said that, I'm an educator. Do I believe we can have an impact? Absolutely. But is that impact always measurable by results on the standardized test, particularly in Massachusetts when you're asking kids to reach the top quartile? I'm not sure that is really valid. So, education correlated with SAT scores in college and outcomes so much that the predictive power of SAT is actually reflecting the parent's socioeconomic status. So, again, the reason I keep bringing this in is we are currently, nationally, because of NCLB, the schools that serve the most needy children have had resources taken away because they did not make adequate yearly progress. They have lost resources through Title I funding that is now going to funding kids to go through school choice to other schools that are higher performing. But really what it's doing is funding kids who go from poorer schools to schools that might have an economic base that's higher. And so the children that are left in the school that has high poverty now have fewer resources. So that has been what has happened on the national level with this NCLB movement. In addition, my favorite, I'm also a Title I director, is that if you continue to not perform, the school now has to pay for children to get outside tutoring by private for-profit organizations, such as Sylvan Learning Center. Those organizations were set up and are popping up all over the place because the federal funds that were intended for schools serving high poverty populations are now being used to fund those children going to these private for-profits because the school is such a failure. And the school is a failure because it serves high poverty children. Again, we might as well just go out and measure the socioeconomic level of the parents and just tell schools how much money they're going to lose. So that's a concern. With all due respect to our commissioner, he loves to talk about the Massachusetts miracle and how well we score on these NEEPs. But the reality, when you look at the U.S. Census Bureau, is the educational attainment of Massachusetts residents on average is second only to the District of Columbia. In other words, we have the most educated population in our state. In addition, our median household income is always in the top 3 to 5. In other words, the miracle of Massachusetts is who the parents are, not necessarily that our schools are making the miracle. Now, I work in Massachusetts schools. I'm proud of working here. I'm proud of the fact that our Department of Education has set high standards. But what happens on the federal level when legislators who don't necessarily have that depth of understanding get involved in trying to legislate, or ballot questions come up where the population as a whole is being manipulated into believing they're legislating something better for children? So the growth model. So I understand from Dr. Vera, from everything I've read, that in order to do away with this ridiculous AYP game where the highest scoring state has the highest, or among the highest percentage of failing schools, they had to come up with something that would use test scores. So our Department of Education has a lot of people who do their research and have looked at a variety of models, the value-added model, BAM. So what they've come up with sounds good on the surface, and Dr. Baird was going to get into what is growth, and I have a few slides from the department to just help people understand this a little bit, because it is incredibly complex. In fact, I looked up the formula, and it has all kinds of complexities. Created by statisticians, not necessarily people who work with children. So what it is the growth model starting with MCAS. MCAS shows how each student is achieving relative to state standards. That's called a standardized measure. It's criterion referenced, not norm referenced. A norm referenced instrument gives you a percentile. Your child, when they took this test, is on the 30th percentile compared to all other kids in the nation. That means 70% of the kids did better. That's a normative measure. MCAS is criterion referenced, which means possibly everybody will be needs improvement. There's no percentile. And in fact, most kids were needs improvement when they first came out. So MCAS is standards-based, meaning you're not going to get a percentile. You're going to get, did you meet the standard? Did you almost meet the standard? Did you not meet the standard? And so it's asking, is a child proficient in 6th grade math, according to Massachusetts standards? And you can't compare them year to year. The MCAS is not internally calibrated. What does that mean? That means that 4th grade, you have to be on the 76th percentile with your skills nationally to be proficient. But in 5th grade, only the 68th percentile. In 7th grade, you have to be on the 60th percentile, etc. And in fact, I did a sort of, created a kid called Mr. 69. Mr. 69 is always on the 69th percentile. No matter what he does, he scores better than 69% of every other kid in the nation. He would be proficient as a 3rd grader, needs improvement as a 4th grader. He would be needs improvement as a 5th grader. He'd be proficient as a 6th grader and needs improvement as an 8th grader. It's not internally calibrated because it was never designed to have that accountability from the federal government on top. Even so, it should have been a little better calibrated, because a family who has a 3rd grader, a 6th grader, and an 8th grader, and this magic family that maybe always, whatever they do, they come on they get the 69th percentile, they'd have a kid who's needs improvement, proficient, and advanced. Doesn't make any sense. How you scored, real quick, compared to every other child who scored just like you the year before, your academic peers. And the rate of change is expressed as a percentile. Now we get percentiles because what they're doing with the growth measure is they're saying, in 5th grade, we take all the children who scored at a 230, which would be a needs improvement, and we see how they score in 6th grade, and there'll be some students who go up to advanced. might be the top 2%. And then there'll be some students who score worse, and that might be the bottom percent. So your growth measure is comparing it to supposedly your peers. So we are getting these growth percentiles for students. The positive thing, so here's a picture of what it could look like. The positive aspect of this growth percentile is we can see change, positive change, and positive growth on the part of the student, even if they're still scoring needs improvement. They can score needs improvement as a 4th grader, and needs improvement again, and we can see that perhaps their growth is in the 75th percentile of all, compared to all the other kids who score needs improvement. It seems to make sense, but there are a lot of questions about the validity of this for a number of reasons. First of all, it hasn't been, and these are the Department of Education's giving all these scenarios, which statisticians have figured out, but the challenge is what other factors factor into the students' test scores from year to year that have absolutely nothing to do with what's happening in the classroom itself. So, the factors that make poverty and parental education a factor in how a student scores the first time are still present when they take the test the second time. And so it's possible that a student scored low from a higher SES family on a particular test, but might grow the next year because they have a better year. But the student who is low SES is still going to have all those stressors. So my question is, have the studies been done? I mean, we have hundreds and hundreds of studies on the fact that SES affects test scores. Have they been done on the fact of how they affect growth over time? So the unknown and the caution is, we don't know if this is a valid measure. So here's the Department of Education's scenario. Gina scored a 230 in grades 5, 6, and 7. And compared to her peers, she's on the 35th percentile of growth. Harry scored a 248, 248, 244. Those are all proficient. But he might be in the bottom quartile. And Ivy, who scored 214, that's a failure, and then needs improvement, might be in the 92nd percentile. So is this information valuable to schools? Yes. As a school, we can look at it and say, okay, we know our kids. And when we look at our kids that we do know, what have been the factors? Oh, well, we know that that child's family just went through a trauma. That's why he didn't score as well this year. And we know that this child's family, well, not a lot different happened in that family, but this year the growth went up. Oh, we introduced a new math program. The information will be very valuable to schools. My concern is it being used for teacher evaluation because there are so many other factors. So, you know, we look at growth, and I'm just going through the Department of Education has many slides and presentations. You can go online and look about the growth factor. It is useful. I've used it as a curriculum director to sit down with teachers and say, wow, this group of kids really did go up, even though there still needs improvement. What do you think happened? And teachers are pretty good about saying, you know what, those 4 kids got that intervention. It's useful. But for teacher evaluation, I am concerned.